Hello and thank you for joining us on the Spinroom. I'm your host, Ami Kaufman. Today we are joined by British Conservative Party member Andrew Percy. Mr. Percy was elected Member of Parliament for Brig and Goole in 2010. He supported Brexit and in March this year converted to Judaism. Andrew, thanks for coming on the show.
It's a pleasure. Good to be here.
In studio to partake in the discussion are David Menser, Israel-UK political communications specialist and former director of Labour Friends of Israel, and I-24 News correspondent in London, visiting us here in Tel Aviv, Jonathan Sacerdoti. Thanks, guys, for coming on the show.
Great to be here.
Our three topics of discussion today with Parliament member Percy are: the UK and EU failed yesterday to reach a deal on Brexit. What exactly happened and why? We'll then discuss the special relationship between the UK and the United States. Just how special is it these days? And we'll end our discussion on another relationship issue, the UK and Israel and British Mideast policy. Okay, our first topic is Brexit. The EU and UK failed to reach an agreement yesterday as reports revealed that a potential deal might involve Northern Ireland remaining within the EU's single market and customs union. The backlash was quick and fierce from Theresa May's allies in government, Northern Ireland's Democratic Unionist Party, who opposed such a deal, but also from leaders in Remain-heavy Scotland and London who want that kind of a deal for themselves too. Andrew, Brexit seems to be coming at a high price. Is it really worth risking the peace in Northern Ireland and all the prosperity that comes with being in the EU?
Well, there's no need to risk the peace in Northern Ireland, actually. This is a solvable issue. And I don't think, actually, when we start talking about the peace process, it's helpful to say that Britain's decision to leave the EU is going to impact on that. The truth of it is that, you know, the peace process was largely driven by the two governments in Dublin and in London. The UK and Ireland obviously have a strong history long before we joined the European Union. So this is solvable, and nobody on either side of the border in Ireland wants to see a return to a hard border. So this should be something that can be solved.
Jonathan, how real is this possibility of the Good Friday Agreement being hurt and seeing the return of violence? Could things really spiral out of control quicker than we think?
I don't think we're talking about violence yet,
right.
But certainly the Good Friday Agreement is really important in terms of Great Britain's relationship with the Republic of Ireland and specifically Northern Ireland's part in the Union. And so I think when Theresa May chose, after that disastrous snap election that she called and then effectively lost, I think when she chose to go into an informal coalition with the DUP, she must have seen this coming, because the rest of us did. Ireland was always going to be an issue in the Brexit negotiations, and getting into bed with the DUP, relying on them for those 10 members of Parliament to bolster her in Brexit and budget votes, which is what the deal is, well, that was always going to mean that this was going to be an extremely hard part of the equation.
Andrew, I want to ask you about the price again. How do you feel about the divorce payment that you're going to have to be paying to Brussels of the price of 50 billion euros? Surely this is money that you would have wanted to use otherwise, different ways.
Well, there are two elements to this. First of all, we've made a commitment on the European budget through to 2020. Of course, we're going to make good on those commitments. That gets you to about £20 billion. We were always really clear about that as a government, that we will maintain the commitments we've made. If that covers a transition period, there may be something on top of that. I mean, it may be that we choose to pay into certain elements of European funding, be that Euratom or Horizon funding, because we see there's a benefit there to the UK. But whatever the so-called price of exiting the European Union is, it is a lot less than we would be paying in if we continued our membership, where the budget goes up every single year. We really don't effectively have a way of preventing that, as we saw even with the deal David Cameron got. So I think in the long run, this is better for the British public, which is why we voted for it.
David, very quickly before we go for a break, do you think that's right, that it actually works out better if we do the math? Even this 50 billion really isn't that much?
Look, Brexit is a good idea, but it has been executed in the most phenomenally bad way. I think it's the biggest act of self-harm that Britain has done to itself for many, many, many years. And a good idea has been handled so badly because the actual advocates propagating Brexit, Theresa May herself, didn't actually vote for it in the first place. So that is the biggest problem here.
All right, we have to go for a quick break. When we come back, more with Tory Member of Parliament Andrew Percy. Stay with us. We're back on the Spinroom with Tory Member of Parliament Andrew Percy. Andrew, back to you. The DUP is a party that doesn't have a majority in a province that voted Remain. And yet Theresa May is basically being held hostage by them. Would you agree that this proves the snap election that she called for was the worst mistake that she ever made?
Look, I actually think the decision to call the snap election was the right one. I mean, the way in which we executed it as a party will be written about for a very, very many years to come, but specifically writing an election platform, a manifesto, which in many ways targeted our own voters with some particularly negative policies. But I still think at the time she made the decision, it was a good one to make. There was a lot of discussion following the referendum as to how legitimate it was. Look, we had a general election in which the two main parties went into that election saying very clearly they would support Brexit and make good on it. The British public endorsed that with 85% of their votes. So, you know, it didn't work out as it should have done, or as we hoped it would for the Conservative Party, but I still think it was the right decision.
David, I want to ask you about Labour and Brexit. Do you feel that it's failing its voters by not really being a strong enough opposition to this? It feels like the party has been kind of ambiguous. Is it really holding government to account over this process?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not.
I mean, it is failing in its duty completely. I think they've taken an attitude where, you know what, this is really complicated. Let's just keep out of it and let them get on. Let the Conservatives get on with it. And that is the strategy that they're taking. And it's not a bad political strategy in itself, because the Conservatives are having a pretty damn good job of beating themselves up, which is, of course, classic Conservative behaviour, because they always do this about Europe. Right. Even though we've had the referendum has been won to leave the European Union, they're still beating each other up. And it looks like this government is tremendously unstable.
What do you think about Labour's...
I think David's right in that sense. I mean, the Labour Party has at the moment its worst possible leader in terms of traditional measures of somebody that could win an election and run a country well. And yet they're doing so well in the polls because the Conservative Party appears to have the worst possible leader it could choose. Somebody who, when we think she's at her weakest, proves us wrong by showing something even weaker. Yesterday being a perfect example, this DUP moment during the day, just as she was about to agree with Juncker, the most complicated part of the negotiation so far, and she has to run out of the room to take a phone call with Arlene Foster, run back in and do a press conference where she gives no questions to the press, saying that it's all over. And all she has is Juncker, that most trusted of political figures, saying she's a very strong negotiator, this woman. I mean, maybe she managed to negotiate that into the press conference, but other than that, I can't see any success she's had.
Andrew, what do you think of former Prime Minister Tony Blair's attempts to, what they say, to quote, reverse Brexit?
Well, I think whenever Tony Blair mentions or speaks on Brexit, Brexiteers are heartened and cheered, because he has very little support in the UK. And the more he perpetuates this fantasy land in some way, we ignore the result of the public in both a referendum and in a general election, then the better for Brexiteers. I just take issue with a couple of points made previously, though, is, first of all, Labour can't have a coherent position on this because a good chunk of their voters actually voted Leave. And Labour are not actually doing that well in the opinion polls, despite some very difficult self-inflicted wounds on the Conservative Party in the last few months. Actually, we seem to be tying in the opinion poll. So, you know, that perhaps says more about their leader than the Conservatives. But, you know, things are not as good for Labour as perhaps some would have us believe.
Okay, I want to move on to our next topic. The next topic is the recent tension between the UK and the United States, exacerbated after President Donald Trump retweeted 3 inflammatory videos posted by the deputy leader of the UK far-right group called Britain First. Back to you, Andrew. Right now, from what I understand, a working visit is still penciled in for the end of February. I think it's the 25th or 26th. Should England withdraw the invitation for the state visit of Donald Trump that I believe was given to him by Theresa May?
Well, look, I think the first thing to say is that retweeting those tweets from Britain First, who are a far-right neo-Nazi party, is just completely unacceptable. They're a disgusting bunch of racists, and none of us want anything to do with them. That said, you know, on the broader issue of the relationship, look, it's a really strong and deep relationship, not least because of our cooperation on intelligence and security, and that's our most important relationship in the world. I don't think the Prime Minister will be thumbing through her diary trying to tie down a date for Donald Trump's state visit. But I hope he comes here in February because, frankly, you know, sometimes it takes friends to tell other friends when they're getting things wrong. So I think, you know, we want to see President Trump here. The relationship is more important than any two individuals who occupy the two positions of President and Prime Minister at any time. Yeah. So I hope he still comes because I think that's important for this special relationship.
Jonathan, does Britain want to expose, shall I say, is that the word, expose the monarchy to someone as controversial as President Donald Trump, or is that something they want to avoid? Maybe keeping the working visit is the way out of it. Maybe the photo op of the Queen and shaking the hand of Donald Trump is something that
there have been plenty of awkward photo ops. The Queen, as the head of state, meets plenty of tyrants and dictators from around the world. Donald Trump is the leader of the free world. He's the president of the United States. Whatever we have to say about the guy's more idiosyncratic style, especially on social media, he is still who he is, and he's certainly very far away from some of the many terrible people the Queen has had to meet in that job. That's part of what she does. But in terms of the Britain-US relationship, Theresa May felt that it was appropriate to say that he shouldn't have retweeted those comments from Britain First. That was probably right, because it's a far-right British group, so she felt she needed to say something. Right. But that's just about it. I mean, there's plenty of stuff to talk about with Trump. The sideshow of his Twitter seems to always engage the media. We're always obsessed with it. But the guy's doing actual work behind the scenes, and that includes work with Britain. It includes potentially a trade relationship after Brexit, which is essential for Britain.
Andrew, I want to talk. You brought up polls. I want to show you a poll from Survation. This time last year, Labour was about 15 points behind the Tories in that poll. This weekend, the latest Survation poll, we're going to put it up on the screen, puts Labour 8 points ahead. I mean, you must be doing really horribly if Jeremy Corbyn, labeled a radical left-winger and basically not too shy to say that himself, is ahead 8 points of Theresa May. And what are you doing wrong?
Well, a week before that, there was a poll out saying the Tories were 4 points ahead of Labour, and previous to that, I think 2 polls a couple of weeks ago having us effectively tied. You know, the incredible thing, as I've said, given we have inflicted some pretty serious wounds on ourselves in the last few months, is how little the polls have actually moved. I think, you know, a lot of people talk about have we hit peak Corbyn, and certainly in a constituency like mine, he has very little appeal in a traditional Labour constituency, and there's no real evidence so far of any growth. But look, you know, we've had a bad few months, partly because of some of our own decisions, and I still think Jeremy Corbyn is unelectable. I still think the British people will not elect him to be Prime Minister. He's a dangerous, dangerous man.
David, on the flip side, though, shouldn't Labour be doing, and Corbyn, shouldn't be doing better in the polls, considering the massive mess that Theresa May is in right now? Shouldn't the numbers even be more than 8 points?
Well, of course they should be, but let's not forget at the last general election just a few months ago, Labour received 40% of the vote. That's 40% of the country voted for effectively a communist. So, you know, I think he's doing better than a lot of people would think he was doing. Just going back to that point about Trump and putting the Queen in a difficult situation, you know, the Queen has met lots and lots of unsavory characters, from Colonel Gaddafi to every Arab despot around the world.
Right.
What I always think about with the Queen is, isn't it remarkable that she has not set foot in this country, Israel?
In Israel.
After all these years, 70 years, the Queen has not deemed it fit or felt it able to.
And Jonathan has reported on that quite extensively for I-24.
That still,
whenever the Queen comes up, that's one of the conversations we have, and we hear that Prince Charles came to Perez's funeral and this, that, and the other. Officially, they won't come here.
All right, well, we're going to have to go out for another quick break. When we come back, more with the Tory Member of Parliament, Andrew Percy. Stay with us. We are back on the Spinroom with Tory Member of Parliament Andrew Percy. Andrew, I want to ask you one last question on this topic about, you know, internal politics. Is there a danger that because of Brexit being so time-consuming that you neglect other important issues like, you know, the suffering of the middle class? I mean, how much of a bandwidth does this government have when it is so embroiled in Brexit?
I mean, that's a really good question, and it is a significant challenge, to put it mildly. You know, Brexit is so consuming in terms of parliamentary time, for ministers, but there's plenty of other stuff going on. As we saw in the budget last week, some significant moves on housing, trying to help more young people onto the housing ladder. We had a whole range of announcements aimed at trying to help, you know, ordinary working families, whether it was changes to the personal tax allowance. So there is room for other stuff, but I don't pretend for a moment that, you know, Brexit is not going to dominate for the next 18 months, 2 years.
Okay, let's move on to our last topic. Last topic of the day is yet another special relationship, the one between Britain and Israel, and let's talk a little about Mideast policy in general. Andrew, French President Emmanuel Macron warned Donald Trump yesterday the consequences of moving the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Where do you stand on that, and also where do you stand on moving the British Embassy?
Well, look, the British government's position is very clear. We're not moving the embassy from Tel Aviv, and we stand by the long-held British government position, which is the situation with East Jerusalem will be determined as part of any negotiation between Israel and the Palestinians. Look, but the reality of the situation is, speaking personally, everybody knows Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. It's going to remain the capital of Israel. I would question whether or not anything should be done at this moment in time to inflame the situation, particularly given the US is working on its blueprint as part of the peace process. So, you know, we won't be moving our embassy, but I think everybody is absolutely clear Jerusalem is and will always be the capital of Israel.
Jonathan, your take?
It's great to hear an MP say that, and I'll tell you why. Because in this whole discussion with Trump, something I've said for years, we often hear about confidence-building measures in the peace talks between the Palestinians and the Israelis, but we never really tend to see confidence-building measures made in favour of the Israelis for them to build their confidence. And currently, the British have what is the closest thing they have to an embassy for the Palestinians in Jerusalem, and yet their embassy for Israel is in Tel Aviv, not far down the road from here.
Right.
And the question there is, wouldn't it be a confidence-building measure, in the light of what we've just heard a member of the British Parliament say, to move the British embassy to a part of Jerusalem that is not disputed? But are you worried about the
consequences when people say security issues? I want to ask you the same question as well.
The consequences need to be reflective of the reality. If everybody is willing to accept, and Donald Trump saying himself that whether or not he makes this move now, he does know that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel.
So you don't share the view of Emmanuel Macron and who's worried about the consequences? What about you, David? Do you share Emmanuel Macron's fear?
Let's remember who we're dealing with. We're dealing with Donald Trump. What's his famous book called? It's called The Art of the Deal.
Yeah.
Right. Now, he is involved, we know, behind the scenes, through his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, in some negotiations. I am almost positive that this is part of the negotiation. And, you know, there's a lot of things you can say about Donald Trump, but his ability to make a deal is probably one of his strongest points. There's a lot of other things you can say, but he is good at making deals between two disparate sides. So I wouldn't be surprised at this if this isn't part of his whole making a deal strategy. Because you're right, there are dangers that it will inflame the tension, but also it is the right thing to do. Exactly as Andrew says, very wisely, it is the right thing to do.
Well, Andrew, you know, Britain has a traditionally good relationship with Saudi Arabia. Can you see Britain using its position with Israel and Saudi Arabia to push a regional deal, especially because Britain's standing amongst Palestinians isn't, you know, as strong as that?
I mean, again, I think that's an interesting question. I think the challenge comes, of course, that our position has always been that, you know, you won't achieve any peace unless there's direct negotiation between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I mean, the UK, Britain obviously stands ready to do its part, but I'm not sure how effective an outside imposition of any plan is going to be unless there is that direct discussion between the Israelis and the Palestinians. But look, you know, we obviously have influence in Saudi Arabia. Obviously, we have an incredibly strong relationship with Israel. So, you know, the government's made perfectly clear it stands ready to support whatever peace process is deliverable.
David, you know, I want to ask you, similar to what we asked before about internal issues and how much Brexit affects that, but when it comes to, you know, foreign politics, foreign affairs, can Britain be a major player for peace in this region when the Foreign Office seems to be, again, totally consumed with Brexit, the bandwidth issue?
No, of course, Brexit has incapacitated the UK for at least, I would say, Andrew was being very generous, saying a couple of years, I would say maybe a decade. So there is a big problem there. But also, in Britain, there's been a long-standing tradition of number 10 Downing Street being supportive and understanding of Israel, and the Foreign Office being particularly hostile and much more, seeing its interests much more aligned with the Arab world. Yeah. And I think the days of UK making a real impact on the Middle East peace process are long gone.
Yeah, would you agree with that?
And I think as well, I mean, look at the people that have tried it. I mean, there's a litany of failed attempts. So it's not in Britain's interest to get involved in this particular issue right now.
Very quickly, Jonathan?
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't think Britain particularly wants involvement. America maybe doesn't want involvement, but then does because it's the great deal. Britain wants a trade relationship with Israel following Brexit.
And Andrew, in the last 20 seconds that we have, do you think that Britain has a limited, availability here in this region because of Brexit?
No, I don't think that's true. I disagree profoundly with David on that. I think actually look at what we're doing through Department of International Trade, as well as the beefing up of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Actually, part of our vision of a global Britain, we're much more proactive in many parts of the world we haven't been in the past.
Okay.
And we're already seeing that executed.
Okay. All right. That is all the time we have. I want to thank our panelists, Jonathan Sacerdoti and David Menser. And a special thank you to today's guest, Andrew Percy of the British Conservative Party. Thank you, sir, for coming on the show.